sweet corn. And I know, I can hear you already. Corn is the most American vegetable there is. How can the Amish not grow it? They grow field corn by the acre for the animals. And for cornmeal, that's different. I'm talking about the sugary sweet corn you and I plant in our backyards. Here's the problem. Sweet corn takes up enormous real estate for a very narrow harvest window. You need a block at least 4 rows by 4 rows for decent pollination. That's 16 square feet minimum. And you get what? A dozen ears per plant if you're lucky. 1 ear, actually, maybe 2. The sugars convert to starch within hours of picking. You can't store it without freezing or canning. And even canned, it's mediocre. Sarah told me, why would I give 20 square feet to 1 meal when I could give it to cabbage and feed us for 3 weeks? A University of Wisconsin trial on small plot caloric efficiency showed sweet corn returns about 400 calories per square foot per season. Potatoes in the same space return over 2,000. If you're in zones 3 and 4, sweet corn is also a gamble with your short season. Zones 5 through 7, you can get away with it, but it's still a space hog. Zones 8 and 9, the corn earworm pressure alone will drive you insane. I gave up sweet corn 3 years ago. I put potatoes where my corn patch used to be, and my winter food storage went from about 50 pounds to over 200. Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are having a moment in restaurants. I get it. Roasted with bacon, they're delicious. But to grow them properly, you need 100 days plus of cool weather after transplant. They take up about 3 square feet per plant. And you get what? 30 or 40 sprouts per stalk. The Amish grow cabbage, which is essentially a giant Brussels sprout if you think about it botanically, and gets you the equivalent of 100 small sprouts worth of eating in a single head you can store whole for 6 months. A University of Vermont extension study on cold-hardy brassicas showed that on a pound per square foot basis, cabbage outproduces Brussels sprouts by a factor of about 4 to 1. Zone 3 and 4 gardeners, you actually can grow Brussels sprouts because you need that cold snap to sweeten them, but the yield question still stands. Zones 5 through 7, you'll get a crop, but you'll tie up that ground from May to November. Zones 8 and 9, they don't color up properly without a real frost. I'm standing there looking at enough food to feed that family from November through April. And I didn't believe her when she said most of it came from that little 40 by 60 patch. 2 months later, her neighbor, who keeps a phone in a shed out by the road for emergencies, sent my wife a couple of pictures. One was of Sarah holding up a cabbage that had to weigh 14 pounds. The other was a shot of the root cellar in January, still 3/4 full. 340 pounds of potatoes out of a plot smaller than most suburban living rooms. 340. I had to sit down. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 7 vegetables the Amish deliberately refuse to grow, and more importantly, why so. You can rethink your own garden this season and stop wasting space the way I did for 2 decades. And stick around to the end because I'll share a technique I picked up from Sarah's mother-in-law, a woman who must have been 75 years old, for storing cabbage through the entire winter without a root cellar or a fridge, using nothing but newspaper and a cardboard box. I haven't seen it mentioned in a single gardening book, and it's the reason her family eats coleslaw in March. Now, let me be straight with you. I'm not a beginner at this. I've read Mel Bartholomew cover to cover. I've got 3 of Elliot Coleman's books dog-eared on my shelf. I've been subscribed to every extension bulletin from Penn State to Oregon State for longer than some of you have been alive. I've tried square-foot gardening. I've tried bio-intensive. I've bought the row covers, the drip irrigation, the fancy seed-starting mats, the grow lights that cost more than my first car. But what I realized spending real time with families in Lancaster County and later in Holmes County, Ohio, and a couple of the Indiana settlements, is that I'd been thinking about the garden completely backward. I'd been thinking about it as a hobby that produces food. They think about it as food that happens to be a garden. That shift changed everything for me, and it didn't require buying a single product. There's a Pennsylvania Dutch word the Amish use, gelassenheid, and it's usually translated as yieldedness or submission, the idea of letting go of your own will. But out in the garden, it takes on this practical edge. It means you don't plant what you want. You plant what the land, the season, and your family actually need. You yield to reality instead of fighting it. And when you've got 11 people at the dinner table, and the nearest grocery store might as well be on the moon because you're not driving to it anyway, you learn real fast that every square foot has to pull its weight through February, not just look pretty in July. And here's where the science backs them up completely. A Cornell study on caloric return per square foot in small-scale gardens found that the top 5 producers by actual usable calories are potatoes, winter squash, dry beans, cabbage, and onions. The bottom of that list, sweet corn, lettuce, cauliflower. The Amish figured this out through generations of keeping people alive through winter, long before anybody was publishing papers on it. Modern research caught up to what Amish grandmothers already knew. Pumpkins. Jack-o'-lantern pumpkins specifically. The Amish grow winter squash absolutely. They grow Hubbards and butternuts and delicata and kabocha by the wagon load. But the big orange Halloween pumpkins? No, because they're ornamental. The flesh is stringy, watery, and low in sugar compared to a real pie pumpkin or a butternut. They take up enormous space. Those vines will run 15 feet, and they're growing a decoration, not a food. Eli showed me his butternut patch and said, "These feed us. Those other ones feed a porch step." A butternut squash stores on a shelf for 6 months at room temperature, gets sweeter over time, and gives you dense, sweet flesh you can use for pies, soups, roasting, baby food, anything. Zones 3 through 9, skip the Halloween pumpkins and plant butternuts and Hubbards instead. Let me share some patterns I've noticed in how most of us approach vegetable gardening and how the Amish approach handles things differently. I did most of these myself for years, so no judgment here. First pattern, we plant for variety instead of for calories. It feels logical because the seed catalogs are full of beautiful pictures and we want a diverse harvest. But the Amish plant for storage. Every crop has to answer the question, will this feed us in February? If the answer is no, it better be producing something that can be canned, frozen, or dried. A University of Maine study on homestead food security found that gardens optimized for caloric storage produced roughly 4 times the winter food supply of gardens optimized for fresh eating on the same square footage. Second pattern, we plant what we like to eat fresh in summer. It feels logical because that's when we're gardening, but the Amish plant what they like to eat in winter because summer is the working season and winter is the eating season. When I shifted my garden plan from what sounds good in July to what I want in my pantry in February, my whole garden changed. I started growing more potatoes, more winter squash, more storage onions, more dry beans. My grocery bill in winter dropped by about 40%. Third pattern, we give equal space to every crop. It feels logical because you want a balanced garden, but the Amish give the biggest plots to the biggest producers. Potatoes get the most space. Cabbage gets the next most. Winter squash gets a corner where it can sprawl. The fiddly crops, the peppers and the fancy tomatoes and the herbs, those get small corners and raised beds. Space allocation should match caloric return, not personal preference. Fourth pattern, we buy new seeds every year. It feels logical because the catalogs are so enticing, but the Amish save seed from the best plants every year. And over generations, they develop varieties suited to their specific soil and climate. That cabbage Sarah was growing, the 14-pounder, that seed line has been in her husband's family for 6 generations. You can't buy that in a catalog. Artichokes. I mention this one because I see backyard gardeners in Zone 6 and 7 attempting these every year, and it breaks my heart. Artichokes are perennials in Zones 8 and warmer. Anywhere colder, you're growing them as annuals, which means an enormous plant about 4 feet across that takes up space all season to give you at best half a dozen edible buds. The Amish look at that math and laugh politely. If you're in Zone 8 or 9 and they overwinter, fine. They're beautiful plants, but the calorie return is negligible. Sarah's phrase for crops like this was garnish crops. Things you grow to put on top of real food. Real food is what feeds you in February. Lettuce. And I'm going to qualify this one. The Amish do grow lettuce, but they grow it as a spring and fall crop in small successions, and they don't dedicate real garden real estate to it the way market gardeners do. What they refuse to grow is the fancy stuff, the baby mesclun mixes, the radicchio, the specialty Asian greens. Why? Because lettuce is 95% water. It doesn't store. It doesn't preserve. You can't can it, freeze it, or dry it meaningfully. It's a fresh eating crop and nothing more. Amish families eat cabbage slaw all winter instead of salad because cabbage stores for 6 months and lettuce stores for 6 days. A University of California study on water use efficiency in leafy greens versus storage crops found that cabbage delivers roughly 12 times the edible calories per gallon of irrigation water compared to head lettuce. That's not a small gap. In Zones 3 and 4, your lettuce window is short anyway. Zones 5 through 7, you can get spring and fall crops. Zones 8 and 9, it bolts the second it gets warm. I want to tell you about a conversation I had on a back porch in Lancaster County that still sits with me 5 years later because it flipped something in my head I'd been wrong about for probably 25 years of gardening. I was standing there looking at this enormous kitchen garden. I mean a real working garden feeding 12 people. And I started running my mouth about my tomato varieties and my sweet corn and my eggplants. And the woman I was talking to just sort of smiled at me the way you smile at a kid who's very proud of a drawing. And then she said real gentle, she said, "We don't grow most of those." And I'll be honest with you, I thought she was joking because here's what I'd been doing for 20-some years. Every February, I'd get the seed catalogs, and I'd sit there at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I'd order everything. Heirloom tomatoes, 6 varieties. Eggplant, because the picture looked nice. Cauliflower, every single year, even though every single year it bolted on me, or the heads came out the size of a golf ball and yellow. Sweet corn, 12 rows of it, fighting the raccoons all summer, sweating through July with mosquitoes eating me alive on my hands and knees, weeding between stalks that were taller than me. And you know what I'd pull out of all that work? Maybe a couple of dozen decent ears. A bushel of tomatoes I couldn't give away fast enough before they rotted. A freezer full of eggplant I didn't actually want to eat. I was growing a grocery store's produce section in my backyard, and I was exhausted, and half of it went to waste. So when Sarah, that's the woman on the porch, when Sarah told me they don't grow those, I said something a little stupid. I said, "Well, what do you eat then?" And she looked at me with this calm, patient expression and said, "We eat what feeds us through February." The community I want to take you to first is a settlement in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, just south of the Gap, where the roads narrow down and you're suddenly behind a buggy and you realize you're going to be there a while. Rolling hills, white farmhouses, laundry on the line even in October, horses grazing in paddocks that haven't seen a tractor in 100 years. Sarah and her husband, Eli, have 9 children, 3 of them still small, and their kitchen garden sits right off the back of the house, maybe 40 by 60 feet. That's it. That's the whole thing. And from that patch, plus a potato field out back, They feed 11 people year-round. What stopped me cold was what I wasn't seeing. No sweet corn, no eggplant, no cauliflower, no artichokes, no okra unless you were in a warmer settlement, no Brussels sprouts, no fancy lettuces. And I said to her, "Sarah, where's all your produce?" And she laughed and took me into the cellar, and I saw what 25 years of getting it wrong looked like. Shelves floor to ceiling of jars, cabbage heads the size of basketballs wrapped in newspaper, potatoes, onions, winter squash stacked in crates, dried beans in 5-gallon buckets, carrots buried in damp sand. Cauliflower. Oh, cauliflower, the vegetable that broke me personally for about 15 years. Here's the thing about cauliflower. It is one of the most finicky vegetables in the entire brassica family. It needs consistent moisture, consistent cool temperatures, specific day lengths, and you have to blanch the heads by tying the leaves over them, or the sun turns them yellow and bitter. One hot week and it bolts. One cold snap and it buttons up into a useless little nub. The Amish grow cabbage instead every single time. Cabbage is a cousin of cauliflower, grows in the same conditions, but it's bulletproof. Sarah's sister-in-law in Holmes County, Ohio, told me her mother used to say, "Cauliflower is for people who have time to be disappointed." That stuck with me. A study out of Oregon State on brassica productivity found cabbage produces roughly 3 times the usable weight per plant compared to cauliflower, with about a quarter of the labor. In zones 3 and 4, forget cauliflower entirely. Your season's too short and too variable. Zones 5 through 7, it's possible but painful. Zones 8 and 9, the heat will cook the curds before they form. Eggplant. And this one was personal for me because I love eggplant parmesan. I love baba ganoush. I spent years trying to grow big Italian globe varieties. Here's what I finally understood. Eggplant is a warm season crop that wants hot nights. It's a heavy feeder. It's prone to flea beetles and verticillium wilt. And even a good plant gives you maybe 6 to 8 fruits over the whole season. You can't really can eggplant well. It gets mushy. You can freeze it breaded, but it takes up freezer space that could be sweet corn or green beans from your own garden. The Amish grow zucchini and summer squash instead, which crank out fruits for months and can be shredded and frozen for winter baking. Eli told me, and this was one of those lines I wrote down in the truck on the way home. He said, "A plant that gives you 6 meals is not a plant that earns its soil. In zones 3 and 4, eggplant barely matures before frost anyway. Zones 5 through 7, you'll get some, but the labor-to-yield ratio is brutal. Zones 8 and 9, it'll grow, but the flea beetle pressure is relentless.